Season 2 of the hit Hulu show The Handmaid's Tale kicks off right where Season 1 left off with June/Offred, and I apologize because I'm going to be calling her by both those names in this recap, but she, along with the rest of the handmaids, are bountied up in those black vans, and they have masks put on them, and they're taken to a facility, and they don't know what their fate is going to be. And the facility ends up being Fenway Park, a desolate Fenway Park. As a baseball fan, this upset me tremendously. But they are put up on a noose, and nooses around their neck, and it's 3, 2, 1, and they all think they're going to die, and they don't. It's a scare tactic. But because they stood up for Janine, the torture does not stop there. They are also tortured into holding up rocks that they were supposed to throw at Janine to stone her to death in the pouring rain. And this is when the entire group, including Aunt Lydia, find out the news that June is pregnant with child. So she is taken immediately inside, away from the other girls. The torturing stops for June. It continues for the others, though. And she's given food to eat, but she's obviously in a bad mood. She doesn't want to eat the food. And Aunt Lydia says, all right, well, follow me if you don't want to eat this food. And they take her to another room where there is a girl being tortured who is also pregnant. And Aunt Lydia says, if you don't want to eat the food and you don't want to treat this baby right, this is what's going to happen to you. And that girl right there is going to end up being executed as soon as she gives birth. So this can go two ways. You can have a nice life where you follow commands, or you can have an awful life where the next 9 months are going to be hell for you, and you're going to be chained up in this room and tortured. So June agrees to eat the food. All the handmaids are brought in, and the torturing doesn't stop. They have to watch June eat the food, and they're also handcuffed to a stovetop and burned. June is taken then to a doctor's office where she is examined because of the child. And while she's being examined, a guy comes in and gives her clothes back and calls her by the name June, not Offred. This indicates he's a part of Mayday and he's going to help her get out of there. She finds a key with a red tag in her boot, and she follows that key down corridors and hallways, and she ends up to a truck that takes her to another facility, and that facility is a warehouse in a desolate area where Nick, the driver, is located. Nick tells her, all right, you've got to cut your hair. Everybody is looking for you because you're the most prized commodity. You're a pregnant handmaid. So we're going to cut your hair. You also have to change your clothes. And the last step is to get that tag out of your ear. And June, like a badass, just straight up cuts it out. And she's bleeding all over the place, but she is finally free. Now, every episode of The Handmaid's Tale has flashback scenes. And this episode's flashbacks are revolved around her as a mother. And in the episode, June sends her child to school with a little bit of a fever, but gives her aspirin. And during the workday, she misses calls from the school telling her that her child is sick. When she calls the school back, they alert her to the fact that her child was sent to the hospital because they couldn't get in touch with June. And while June finds this annoying, it's understandable because what we've learned about The Handmaid's Tale is there was a problem making children, and every child is obviously precious, so you don't want a sick kid mixing with healthy kids. So while June goes to pick up her child from the hospital, they do an interview, and they're basically asking her, hey, what do you do if the kid is sick? Who stays home with the kid? And finally, they cut to the chase and ask, did you send this kid to school knowing that they were sick because you didn't want to miss a day of work? And that is exactly how serious this child epidemic is in the country. She ends up taking her child home, and that's when the news breaks that the White House has been attacked by this vigilante group. But we're on to episode 2, where June is now on the run. She is hiding out. She is just waiting for the call in this random warehouse facility. And June starts kind of meandering around and realizes that this is a place where a ton of people were slaughtered to death. And when she kind of realizes this, she freaks out on Nick and says, I want to go. I want to go right now, and I'm going to need my daughter, and I got to get out of here. Do you know what happened? And he says, you can't leave right now. Literally everybody out there is looking for you. You need to lay low until the search dies down for you. But most of this episode is focused on Emily. Emily was her companion there for a while. You'll remember Emily because she just hopped in a car and just started joyriding around and eventually ran over some people, giving absolutely no fucks. And she is sent to the colonies. So this is the first episode where we get a look at the colonies. And the colonies are exactly what they sounded like. An absolute dystopian, kind of apocalyptic world that clearly has like radiation poisoning. So basically what happens to the colonies is you go there and the women are forced to work in the colonies without protection. They're just breathing in that air without masks. They're working really without gloves, and they just die this slow, painful death from radiation poisoning, and they get sores. It's a miserable way to live. And Emily has kind of taken it upon herself to be the nurse to these women. She is helping them with their sores, their cuts, and whatnot, because if you remember, Emily was a biology teacher back before all this kind of shit hit the fan. The episode's flashbacks are also revolved around Emily, who we learned before all this stuff happened was a biology teacher, as I previously stated, in a biology department, and she's teaching a class, and a girl comes up, and Emily whips out her phone, and she sees a picture of Emily, her wife, and her daughter, and the girl asks, "Oh, is that your daughter?" And she goes, "Yeah, that's ours." And the next flashback is her talking to another faculty member about why she won't be teaching next semester. And he is also revealed to be gay, and he reveals to her that basically the reason why she won't be teaching is because somebody saw the picture of her and her daughter and her wife. And you're starting to learn more and more about the events that led up to this new world that we're finding out about, where gay people were persecuted for being gay. And the guy who ends up telling her this is eventually killed and hanged up with the word faggot written under him. So it's not exactly the best place to be if you're a homosexual. And Emily obviously is one, but she tries to flee the country with her wife and child. They get to the airport where one guy tells her, "All right, this is enough. You guys are married. You can go." And then when they get to the ICE agent, he tells her, "That doesn't matter anymore. You guys aren't legally married. It just, there's a ruling came over today, and one of you guys can leave, which is her wife, but you have to stay." So her wife and child end up escaping the country, whereas Emily is forced to stay, eventually becoming a handmaid and eventually just losing it and running over the guy, which leads her to the colonies. But the episode doesn't end there. The episode is focused around Emily helping a new woman who arrives at the colonies, who ends up revealing to Emily that she was actually the wife of a former commander. The commander was sleeping with his handmaid on the side, and thus she cheated on the commander. When she was caught, she went to the colony. So Emily gives her some pills to help with the sickness, but it does the exact opposite. And while the woman is in extreme agony, she asks Emily, "What did you give me?" And Emily says, "You tortured women. You helped women get raped by your husband, so you deserve to die alone." And that's what an absolute savage that Emily is. And we saw that in a previous episode, obviously, but she just will not give up this grudge. At the very end of the episode, Janine arrives in the colonies, and they go off and work another day in the colonies. Episode 3 takes place 2 months after episode 2, and June has become quite acclimated to living in this warehouse/office facility, but she gets the call that she's ready to move on, and the dust has kind of settled on looking for her, and they're going to kind of move her out and look to move her to Canada. She asks the driver, "Hey, where is my daughter? Have you heard from Nick?" And he has no idea who Nick is. So that's kind of the way that Mayday works. You don't really know who else you're dealing with. You just know what your job is and what you're supposed to do. And in this case, it is to get June out of this building. And they deliver her to what ends up being Logan International Airport, where she is to meet with another person who she ends up meeting with. And the guy tells her that the plan is to get her to a safe house and then get her to a small airstrip where a guy will land. They'll load her up, and then they'll get her on to Canada. But at the very last second, he gets a text message that really spooks him and freaks him out. And he says, "I'm sorry, but the safe house has been compromised. I got to go." And June obviously doesn't want to stay in an abandoned airport, so she's pleading and begging with him to not leave. And finally, she just parks her ass right in front of the bread truck and refuses to leave. So reluctantly, against his better judgment, says, "Get in the back." And he ends up taking her back to his place, where his wife lives along with his child. And this place is kind of where everybody who wasn't persecuted after all the shit hit the fan, this is where they live. It really looks like public housing, but this isn't where the commanders live, and this isn't in the colonies. This is just where everybody else would live in this new world. And his wife is really annoyed by this. She sees the danger in bringing a pregnant handmaid into their home because she knows that they could be killed for this. So he tells her, sit here, do not make a sound, do not answer the door, don't say anything. Everybody here is listening for something. So just be as quiet as possible. We're going to go to church. We really just do it to make a public appearance. We'll be back at 2 o'clock. Just sit tight. And she does that. She sits tight. There's a little bit of a scare at one point because someone knocks on the door, but she just sits and waits. And 2 o'clock turns into 3 o'clock, 3 turns into 4 o'clock, and finally at 5 o'clock, she has had enough of waiting. She refuses to do it. She goes into the woman's closet, puts on her clothes because all the women in this new world kind of wear the same uniformed outfit, and she walks out. She hops on a train. She doesn't quite know exactly where she's going, but she has a general idea. She has a little map. She gets off at the last stop, and she walks to the airstrip. And she gets the flashback scenes from trying to escape with her husband and daughter because I guess it's in the same wooded area. But she eventually gets to the airstrip where she meets with the pilot, and after some convincing that she is, in fact, the handmaid, her, along with another driver who are trying to escape, get in the plane, and they're about to take off, and it looks like everything's going according to plan. All of a sudden, bullets fly out of nowhere. The driver who hitches a ride, he ends up getting shot. The pilot realizes the gig is up. He just stops the plane, gets out. He is immediately executed, and June is taken. So her escape, albeit so close, is thwarted. A bulk of this episode, though, is focused on her mother, who we learn was a lesbian feminist who at one point in her life abandoned her, and June never really forgave her mother for that. She grew up in a time where bonding was going to feminist rallies. But in the lead up to the eventual takeover of the country, her mother had a lot to say in regards to not just sitting back and waiting. And her mother ends up being correct about those things. And at one point in one of the flashbacks, June is learning how to be a handmaid, and they're showing pictures of the different situations that people are living under. And one of those situations is the colonies, where the picture is of her mother. So June knows that her mother was sent to the colonies for being a lesbian, for being a feminist, and she's going to end up dying. So in this episode, she feels a lot of guilt about leaving her own child behind because she feels like she's doing exactly what her mother did, but she knows it's what's best for her and for her future. Episode 4 starts off with June in that room that we saw a couple episodes back where pregnant women are put if you don't abide by the rules. So June is chained up. She's pregnant. And Aunt Lydia's there and is explaining to her a few things and says, oh, well, you ate well, and calls her Offred. And June says, my name's June. You know my fucking name. And Aunt Lydia says, well, that's interesting because this is what happens to June. June has her baby and gets executed, whereas Offred has a chance to go back and live a life with the Waterfords. The Waterfords are willing to take you back, so it's up to you. If you want to play this game and be June, then fine. You're going to end up dying in a couple months. Or you could put on the red robe and, play by our rules. And reluctantly, June ends up putting on the robe and going back to the Waterfords. So when June goes back to the Waterfords, they play it off like she was kidnapped. And we all know that that was bullshit. And even the Waterfords know that that was bullshit. But really, the issue is the tension between June and not just the Waterfords, but in particular, Mrs. Waterford is just so palpable. Everything she says with an attitude. And the first time that Mrs. Waterford gets June alone, she ends up choking her and kind of punishing her for leaving. And June shoots back, don't forget, if my baby's safe, then your baby's safe. And that's what Mrs. Waterford said to her the first time she showed her where her own child ended up after she was kidnapped and taken back and became a handmaid. But June's having a really tough time reacclimating to the world, which is understandable. She was so close from escape, and now she's put back into this world. She ends up learning that one of the handmaids who stood up for Janine, the girl that was supposed to be stoned to death, ended up getting her tongue cut out. Mayday, the group that tried to get her out, is no longer handling handmaids at all. They're not even worrying about it. They've cut off all contact. So really any hope of her getting out of that place is kind of crumbling around her. Well, because the tension between Mrs. Waterford and June is so real, Aunt Lydia takes June for a walk near the river, and she's explaining to her that this is not just a tough time for you as a handmaid, but it's also a tough time for Mrs. Waterford as well, and to kind of show compassion. And then they take her to that wall where they executed people, and Aunt Lydia says, I think you know this bread truck driver. And it ends up being the guy who reluctantly took her back to his house. He was executed. His wife, just to survive, is now becoming a handmaid, and the child was placed in basically their version of foster care. So June really breaks down at this site. She had no idea what happened to these people, but now she's seeing exactly what her actions did. She ended up getting a man killed and breaking up an entire family and forcing a woman into the life that she was trying to escape herself. And Aunt Lydia keeps asking, well, whose fault is it that the guy is up there? Is that June's fault or is that Offred's fault? Because, and by the way, I apologize because I keep saying Offred, but it's really of Fred, but bear with me. Is it June's fault or Offred's fault? June was the one that ran away. Offred was kidnapped. So Aunt Lydia trying to disassociate June from Offred as one person is working because June is just beside herself at this thought of ruining this family. So she goes back to the Waterfords home and asks if she can stay. And they seem to agree that she will be staying. The next scene is June lying in bed trying to sleep. Mrs. Waterford comes in and touches her stomach and starts talking to the baby. It's kind of a creepy scene. And June seems to be creeped out because she gets up and goes into the closet where we've seen her before go into and lie there. And she, in the first season, carved a message into the closet, into the bottom of it. And while she's lying there, she realizes that somebody has sandpapered that away. So a lot has changed in the time since she tried to escape into now. The flashbacks for this episode have to do with June and her husband and really the relationship between June, her husband, and her husband's ex-wife. If you remember, June was the other woman in this relationship who asked her future husband to leave his then wife. June is confronted by this woman at a yoga class who asked, do you even know what you did? Do you have any idea? Did you care at all that I was there? And June explains to her, look, you need to go to him about this issue. It's really not my concern. You've been separated for 2 months. The woman, clearly upset, ends up calling her a whore and saying that, you know, you're nothing to him. He's just going to end up doing the same thing to you. And then in another flashback, June is sitting in a restaurant with her husband. Her husband goes to get a high chair for their kid, and the woman walks in and sees June, the child, and her husband, and kind of sees what life that her husband is having with this other woman, and she gets upset and leaves. So really the bulk of this episode is focused around how June's actions are negatively impacting other people and how June selfishly isn't realizing what she's doing. She's just doing stuff for her and not realizing how they can negatively impact others. Episode 5 starts out with a very quick checkup of Offred from Aunt Lydia. Aunt Lydia tells her that everything seems to be going well. She has a very uncomfortable conversation with Mrs. Waterford, though, basically saying, you need to start being nicer to her in this household. And then finally, as she's leaving, she hints to Mr. Waterford that she thinks it'll be a boy. But all is not right, because as Offred is going to the bathroom, she has some spotting, so she's got blood coming where it should not, and that is an issue. But she doesn't tell anybody about this. Offred continues to act like business as usual, but she's also acting very strange. And when her and Mrs. Waterford go on a walk, she keeps saying, no, Mrs. Waterford. Yes, Mrs. Waterford, one-word answers. Everyone's noticing that Offred just seems off, including Nick, who approaches Mrs. Waterford and says, I think you should go take her to another kind of doctor for her mental state. Physically, she's fine, but mentally, she just doesn't seem to be the same girl. To which Mrs. Waterford says to Nick, the handmaid isn't any of your concern. Commander Waterford, though, doesn't seem to be interested in Offred or Nick, or even his wife, who he seems to be ignoring. His focus is to the new Rachel and Leah Center, this big new center for whatever the hell the country has become. Commander Waterford's in charge of it, and when he goes to meet with his boss about this, he also expresses an interest of moving his driver, Nick, to another post. He suggests Washington, saying that Nick has way too much talent to be wasting away as a driver, to which his boss says, I'd find a way to keep him because, you know, good men like that are hard to come by. But this is really the first time we're hearing that the commander wants to get rid of Nick, who he seemingly has never had an issue with. But his focus really should be on Offred, because the next scene it's very uncomfortable. She is sitting in a bathtub of her own blood. The spotting has turned into full-blown bleeding. She is still yet to tell anybody about it. She is still acting off, and the next event that she goes to isn't going to help her at all, because it's basically a wedding ceremony. In this new world that they live in, they have a ceremony where they basically give people wives. And Nick is one of those people. Nick is given a wife, and it's basically an arranged marriage, and the girl is 15 years old. And this is one of the ways that they are trying to create more kids in the world, by handpicking people to be with each other. And it's a really uncomfortable scene for Offred as well, because her and Nick obviously have a thing, and Nick wants nothing to do with this arranged marriage. Offred is still dealing with this blood issue, and she's making her way downstairs, and Nick meets with the commander and has a conversation about bringing family into the world now that he's married. And as Nick is leaving, he ends up finding Offred lying in the dirt as rain comes down, and she's covered in blood. So Nick kind of loses his mind, you know, and he picks her up, and the next scene is Offred in the hospital bed, hooked up to these machines where she can still hear her baby's heartbeat. So the baby seems to be okay and survived. And after Mrs. Waterford wakes up and goes to alert the doctors that June has woken up, she says to her baby privately that I will not let you grow up in this place. And we're on to episode 6. The episode starts out with a doctor telling Mrs. Waterford and June that there was a hemorrhage involved, and while there was a lot of blood, the baby looks absolutely fine. And one of the first signs of compassion between Mrs. Waterford and June is when they're having a sonogram, and Mrs. Waterford removes the barrier and says, June, do you want to see the baby? And so it's June's first option to actually see the child that she's carrying. June comes home and faces Nick for the first time since he's been married, and they have that uncomfortable conversation where Nick says, I didn't have a choice, and she makes fun of the fact that, she's 15 years old, and what time does she go to bed? But they genuinely seem happy to see each other again. But Commander Waterford's focus is on this new center that they're opening up. A lot of people in high-power positions will be attending this event. It's going to look really bad if it's not ready to go when it's supposed to open. Commander Waterford assures the committee that it will be ready to go. It doesn't look like it now, but don't worry. When the time comes and they do open the event, everything will go according to plan. But one thing that's not going according to plan is this arranged marriage between Nick and his new wife, Eden. It's very bizarre. She's trying to warm up to him. He wants nothing to do with her. It's painfully obvious that he wants nothing to do with her because, once again, she's 15 years old. Yet he's expected to actually consummate this marriage and bring a child in this world with this teenager that he just met. Mrs. Waterford, though, seems to be kind of bonding with June. She's taking after her a little bit. She's watching her, making sure that everything is going well and that if she needs anything, she's ready to go. And June reciprocates this by letting Mrs. Waterford feel when the baby's kicking. And this is the first time that Mrs. Waterford is able to feel the baby kick. Just like June earlier, it was the first time that June was able to see the baby. So they're kind of coming to a compromise, and Mrs. Waterford asks, what is it like to be pregnant? Because she's never been pregnant. This is the whole dilemma of the country. June goes to get some water from the kitchen and runs into Commander Waterford and brings up the fact that those two haven't talked since she's come back home. Commander Waterford says, what is there to talk about? Well, I don't know, the fact that she ran away and she came back, dipshit, but he says, look, I've had a lot on my plate right now, so to speak, so I'm sorry we haven't talked, but there's really nothing to talk about. The next day, Offred finally has a conversation with Eden, Nick's new wife, and Eden brings up the fact that she thinks that Nick hates her and kind of what to do about that. And Offred says, look, just give it a little bit of time. And Eden says, well, what if he's a gender traitor? That's what they call gay people in that time. What if he's a gender traitor? And Offred assures her, I'm sure he's not a gender traitor. I'm sure he just needs a little bit of time. But this is an issue because if she brings this up to people that Nick could possibly be gay, that's going to be a big deal to his bosses. Mrs. Waterford continues to try to be a little bit nicer to June, and she brings 4 handmaids that are quote-unquote Offred's friends to the table, and they are kind of supposed to chit-chat and hang out. They're not used to doing this because they're not allowed to do this. But while it's uncomfortable to start, they start warming up a little bit, and all of a sudden the baby starts kicking, and all the handmaids come around and feel the baby kick. It's a nice moment. But you can tell that Mrs. Waterford is having some issues with the fact that she herself cannot get pregnant, and she's kind of jealous of June. June kind of presses her luck when Mrs. Waterford brings her up to the nursery, and June asks, can I see Hannah? Can I see my daughter? And Mrs. Waterford said, that's not possible. And this really upsets June, and they're both kind of crying and fighting back tears a little bit, because it is an emotional scene. And Mrs. Waterford says, why don't you get your things from downstairs? I don't think you have to stay in that room anymore. You can go back to your own room. So the honeymoon is over between these two. June's kind of freaks out a little bit, and Nick tries to console her and calm her down. And she says, I thought she could be decent. And she says, by the way, you have to have sex with Eden. Where he says, I can't do that. And she says, yeah, you do. And she explains that she thinks that you're gay, so you have to have sex with her because I can't lose you too. So Nick reluctantly has sex with the girl. I don't know if he, quote, rocked her world, but it was something. Later on, Mr. Waterford and Mrs. Waterford have a heated conversation about Offred and how Offred always wants more and more and more, and at this point it's wanting to see her kid. And Mr. Waterford is kind of trying to play both sides and eventually goes up to Offred's room and gives her a Polaroid picture of her child, Hannah, and they start kind of fooling around a little bit. They quickly stop, but as Commander Waterford's trying to leave, Offred says thank you, and he says our little secret. Well, Commander Waterford has a big day ahead of him because finally this new Rachel and Leah Center is set to open, and it is set to be a huge deal. A lot of people are coming in for this event, but before the event is to kick off, Nick approaches the boss and says that I need to be reassigned immediately. I can't stay in that house anymore, and the boss says, well, you just been issued a woman, and he says, well, it's not her, it's Commander Waterford. There's a lot that I haven't told you about him. Yeah, you got to reassign me. But you got to protect the handmaid. But this Rachel and Leah Center is set to open with a bang because as Commander Waterford continues to talk, and all of the handmaids are outside lined up. One of them starts walking towards the building, and Commander Waterford says, tell her to go back, it isn't time yet. She turns around, faces the window with all of the handmaids, and shows them that she has a trigger. She runs up the steps and pulls the trigger and explodes a bomb. So much for a soft opening. The flashbacks for this episode, by the way, are regarding Mrs. Waterford and kind of where she came from. We know that she was a big part of getting this new country formed. She's kind of the backbone of Commander Waterford, even though she's not allowed to speak or anything like that. She had a lot of ideas that were put in place. And the flashbacks are regarding her writing career that was talked about before when the delegates came. They quickly mentioned that she wrote a book and they read it. And she's at a college campus. She was invited there to talk, but there's a lot of controversy regarding what she wrote about. She wrote about the fact that women should kind of stop doing what they're doing and just focus on having children because it's their biological duty to do that. And she's getting booed off the stage. People are throwing things at her. People refuse to let her talk. And as she's leaving, somebody shoots her in the stomach. That's probably one of the reasons why she can't have a child. And Commander Waterford avenges her death eventually by bringing the shooter to the middle of the woods along with his wife. And he offs his wife and drags the guy away. So the guy has to watch his wife get shot. On to Episode 7. Episode 7 starts out right after the attacks. A lot of high-ranking officials have died in the attack. Also, a lot of handmaids have died in the attack as well. Fred Waterford has survived the attacks, but he's not doing well. He's held up in a hospital. One of the people that's died is the guy that Nick confided in and asked, you got to switch me out of this in the last episode. There's a lot I haven't told you about Fred Waterford. So that guy's dead. Nick probably won't get switched now. He really trusted this guy. So his out of the Waterford house has just passed away. The issue of how did this attack go through is still up in the air. So an investigator has been put into place to find out what happened. He goes and interviews Offred because Offred was Of Glenn's partner, I guess you would say. And Of Glenn was the girl that went through with the attack. And the reason why he's really pinpointing on June is because of the fact that June recently escaped and she knew this girl pretty well, apparently. So he asked her, who helped you escape? And she continues to say that I wasn't escaped, I was kidnapped, but there's obviously some issues here. While she's being interviewed, there's a commotion outside, and one of the Marthas is standing outside and gets executed right in the street. So Offred's really freaked out. She runs into Nick at the hospital when they go to visit Commander Waterford, and she says that this guy is trying to find out who helped me escape. And obviously Nick was one of the guys who helped her escape, and Nick vows to help her out, and don't worry, everything will go according to plan, and you're safe. This doesn't really put Offred at ease, though, and one night she's sitting at the table, and Mrs. Waterford comes in, and she starts telling her that this guy was interviewing me about the fact of, where did I go and who helped me? And she says, you need to tread carefully with that issue. And she says, well, look, that guy killed everybody in Of Glenn's house, everybody who is connected. And he's definitely going to kill anybody who's connected to the underground that he finds. And he definitely will not allow a baby to be born into that household. So we got to figure this out. And Mrs. Waterford says, well, Fred won't allow that. And Offred said, well, Fred Waterford isn't here right now. You are. So once again, we got to figure this out. So unfortunately for these two, while they don't like each other, they kind of got to band together because they have this issue of this inspector. Nick comes home one night and Mrs. Waterford asks if he ever helped the commander basically put a bill together and deliver the bill. And he says, yes, but we need the commander's signature to do that. And she says, I think the commander will forgive me. Can you walk me through the steps? The next day, that inspector shows up, and he's blocked from entering the Waterford's house. And while he's asking, why can't I go in, a black van shows up and accuses him of the same thing that he's trying to figure out. They accuse him of treason, of helping orchestrate the attacks, and they arrest him due to substantial evidence. Because a lot of these handmaids died, they had to bring some back from the colonies, so those black vans showed up and they wrangled up a few of the old handmaids and brought them back. And Janine surprises June at the market, and she says, how are you here? And she explains the fact that, well, because they all died, they brought some of us back, and Janine's one of them, and also Emily is also one of them. She sees Emily in the corner and goes up to her and says, I didn't get to say goodbye to you before you left. And at the very end of it, she says, by the way, my name's June. This was a big deal because nobody knew of Glenn's actual name, and she died trying to help out this cause that all of the handmaids believe in. So June says, my name's June, and this spreads throughout the market where June turns to another handmaid and says, my name's June. She says, my name is so-and-so, and then that girl goes up and tells another handmaid, my name is so-and-so, and that handmaid says, my name is this, and it spreads with everybody telling each other their own name, and not the fake name that they were prescribed. Word of the attacks, though, has gotten back to Canada and gotten back to the group of refugees. Everybody wants to know who has died in the attack, who's alive, and one of those people is Moira, June's best friend. But Moira wants to know actually not who died in this attack, but what happened to her old girlfriend. That's what the flashbacks in this episode revolve around, is Moira's time. We learned that Moira was a mother at one point who did in vitro fertilization, and she met her girlfriend, who was a former doctor. And Moira just wants to know exactly how her former girlfriend died. If she died alone, if she died with family. She's looking over tons of books. She finally finds it. She breaks down a little bit and has a pretty emotional moment, seeing that her former girlfriend was murdered along with her family. There is a press conference held in Canada, and we learned that of Glenn's actual name, though, was Lily. The episode ends with the odd couple of Mrs. Waterford and Offred. She asks that Offred come and meet her in Mr. Waterford's study. She brings her in and gives her a manuscript of these new laws that she's written up, and all the laws that will be scaled back that were put in place by this insane investigator who was put away. And she says, well, you used to be an editor, right? Well, look over these. And June says, well, I need a pen. And you could see that just getting this pen brings her back to that normal feeling that she used to have in the old world. And we move on to episode 8, where you've got Offred and Mrs. Waterford actually kind of becoming friends a little bit. They're having fun working on the bill, and Mrs. Waterford confides in Offred that she absolutely hates knitting, and Offred's doing what she used to do back in the old world. So they've kind of got a little bit of normalcy, but it won't last long, as it's announced that Mr. Waterford will be returning home. When he does, it's very awkward because it's kind of obvious that no one really wants him there. Mrs. Waterford tells Offred that she's going to go check up on the parents of Janine's child, Charlotte. She thinks that the child isn't doing that well. And you don't really think anything of it until later on. All of the handmaids are at the market, and an ambulance goes by. And an ambulance makes a certain sound when it's a child. And one of the handmaids comments that she thinks it's Charlotte, where Janine ends up absolutely freaking out because, it's her kid. And to try to qualm that situation, Offred tells Janine, look, chill out. I'll find out exactly who it is, what's going on, and what can be done. Later on that night, Mrs. Waterford comes to Offred's room and tells her that the baby is sick and she thinks there's more to be done, and that there's a former Martha who's a really, really good doctor that could help this child. And she ends up approaching Fred about bending the rules and trying to save this child's life. This is the second time that Mrs. Waterford is willing to bend such stringent rules. So she kind of begs her husband to just let this one slide, let this former Martha, who was one of the best doctors at the time of the change, look after this kid, and Fred's not willing to do that. Offred brings up the solution of, hey, why don't we just let Janine in the room? What harm could it do? And it takes a lot of convincing, but ultimately, Janine is allowed in the room with her own child. And Lydia says, but if anything goes bad, I'm putting the blame on you, Offred, because this was your idea. But with the child still sick, behind Fred's back, Mrs. Waterford ends up approaching that former doctor who is now a Martha and has her look after the kid. And apparently, the doctor really was that good. The current doctor was just raving about how much he admired this woman who had basically been stripped from being this doctor to become a Martha. So this is the second time that Mrs. Waterford has said, fuck it, I'm breaking the rules. # girl power. But even with one of the best doctors in the world with this child, after extensive tests, the doctor says, look, you got to take this child off ventilation. I'm not sure what's causing this. And all you can really do at this point is pray. Janine is then brought into the room to say goodbye to her child, along with her current parents. Everybody kind of says their goodbyes, and they all go home. And right before June/Offred's about to go to bed, Nick says that the commander wants to see both her and Mrs. Waterford in his office. Fred Waterford says, I heard the Putnams got the help that they needed, and Mrs. Waterford says, yeah, but unfortunately it wasn't enough. And Fred shoots back, well, the most amazing thing is that I signed the transfer order for that Martha, and I never actually did that. And Mrs. Waterford says, look, it was for the best of the child. What more can we do at this time? Mr. Waterford shoots back, well, respect for your husband could be a start. And then he asks, have you been signing executive orders on my behalf? And she admits to it, and he says, look, I wanted you to be my conduit, not my voice. Finally, he holds up a piece of paper and asks June, hey, is this your handwriting? And then he looks at his wife and says, I can't believe you involved a handmaid in this. He then just throws the blame on himself, says, look, it's not your fault, it's my fault, starts flipping through the Bible, reading some passages, and then he undoes his belt and tells his wife to bend over. And in a very uncomfortable scene, Fred Waterford just beats the piss out of his wife, just whipping her over and over again with a belt. Later that night, Mrs. Waterford is taking off her clothes and kind of sees what her husband did in the mirror, and she's really mortified and also horrified at exactly what went down. There's a knock at the door. It's Offred asking if she's okay. Mrs. Waterford says yes and asks, Serena, is there anything I can do for you? And Serena responds with, yes, there is something you can do. You can go back to your room. June walks back to her room, and you see that Serena is crying because she does want to confide in somebody, but she has nobody to confide in. Now, if you're wondering where Nick is in this whole episode, Nick, of course, the newlywed, the happy guy of the house, he ends up coming home to his 15-year-old bride that he is not interested in at all. She ends up telling him that, she's working on the house. How does he like it? He doesn't give a rat's ass about the house. But then he notices that there are a bunch of the letters that are written by the handmaids to get out to their families who have fled the country. And he starts confronting her about these letters. Why are they here? Where did you do with them? Did you read them? This is really the first time that we see Nick truly get pissed off at his wife. He's always kind of been indifferent to her and realizing the situation that he has to be there. But this is the first time he's really, really pissed off that this girl found something that she was not supposed to. The episode finally ends, though, back in the hospital where you've got Janine singing a song, and she's sitting there holding her baby, who's alive. Amazingly, the baby pulled through. Janine being there, I guess, did do something, and the baby has made a full recovery. Episode 9 opens up with the much-talked-about diplomatic trip to Canada finally happening for Commander Waterford. He takes Nick, he takes Mrs. Waterford with him, and he leaves this douchebag soldier boy. That's the best way I can describe this kid. 22-year-old hard ass in charge of the house, which doesn't really go well. But right before they're about to leave, Mrs. Waterford looks at Offred and says, when you have this baby, I want you to go immediately. And that's kind of unheard of. Usually you have the handmaid stick around for a little bit and have a little bit of a transition period. But Mrs. Waterford wants none of that. And this really upsets June. But Commander Waterford doesn't exactly know what he's walking into because word of his arrival has gotten to Canada. And remember, there are a lot of people in Canada who fled from the United States when all this change was going on. Two of those people that are in Canada are Moira, her former best friend, and her former husband, who are planning on protesting his arrival. They initially want to get him arrested for war crimes, but one of the women who seems to be kind of high up in the local government says, look, we can't arrest him for war crimes because it's another country, and while we don't agree with it, you can't do that. So they're not exactly walking into Canada with open arms, but they arrive and they're driving around, and as Mrs. Waterford is looking out, she's seeing all these people walking around happy, all these women walking around happy. And you can tell that she misses the old life. She doesn't want to wear these clothes anymore, and she doesn't want to knit. She misses the old life where women actually had a place. They arrive, though, and they meet with some diplomats from Canada, and one of the guys in charge of immigration who says, well, I used to love visiting the United States. And Mr. Waterford says, oh, well, we look forward to having you again. And he goes, yeah, I can't go anymore because me and my husband are no longer welcome there, obviously because they're gay. It's a little awkward, and they hand Mrs. Waterford her itinerary, which is literally times with pictures. So they're treating this woman like an absolute idiot. She wants a little bit of a distraction, so she ends up going to the hotel bar, and there's a pretty good-looking guy that shows up with a pack of cigarettes, and he kind of starts chatting her up a little bit. And after a little chit-chat, she correctly guesses that he is not just there on happenstance, but he is actually planted there because he's from the American government. And his whole mission is to get her to flee from Canada and go to Hawaii. Because I guess in this new world, Hawaii isn't a part of whatever the hell America's become. So look, we'll get you out, we'll get you to Hawaii, and we'll print any memoir that you want to write on your time in the new United States. And she says, look, that's complete propaganda, and I would never betray my country, which he shoots back. Hun, you already did. That's probably the best treatment that Mrs. Waterford is going to get on this trip, because at one point she's standing in front of an elevator and a mother is there with a little girl, and the girl is staring at Mrs. Waterford in these weird clothes and says, are you a princess? And Mrs. Waterford says, no, not at all. And then she looks at the mother and says, by the way, she's precious. And the mother is freaked out. The mother knows exactly who Mrs. Waterford is, where she comes from, and she lets Mrs. Waterford in the elevator and says, yeah, hey, we'll take the next one, implying I want nothing to do with you, and I don't want you anywhere near my daughter. We're back in Gilead, and that douchebag soldier guy June is really flustered at the fact that she's going to be forced to leave this baby as soon as she gives birth. And she is talking to Janine about this fact, and Janine kind of starts freaking out that you can't leave this kid. You know, you have to wean with the kid, you have to be there for the kid, and just stops dead in the tracks. The soldier kid says, keep moving, and Janine shoots back, how about you suck my dick? Whereas the soldier boy doesn't really take that too well and just absolutely clocks her in the face with the butt end of his rifle and forces Offred to just keep walking. And this doesn't change Offred's opinion on the fact that she doesn't like the soldier boy, but also she's still flustered about this whole baby issue. And she goes to the Martha of the house and asks, have you ever been a godmother? And the Martha replies, no. And she says, look, I need this baby to know love and compassion, and I'm not going to be there for this kid. And I need somebody to look out for this baby when I'm gone. So can you do that? And the Martha responds with, look, I will try my best. But back in Canada, Commander Waterford continues to make the rounds, and there are protests that continue to follow him around. And one of those protests has Offred's ex-husband in it, who busts through the crowd and says, you raped my wife. And while Commander Waterford continues to keep his cool with the matter, Nick and Mrs. Waterford are really just thrown off because they see the picture and they recognize the girl, and it's clearly Offred, and they know that, yep, that's pretty much true. He raped her. And with Commander Waterford going to his meeting, Nick has a little bit of free time, and he searches out Offred's ex-husband, who he finds in a bar and approaches him. And as you'd imagine, Offred's ex-husband is pretty pissed off to see this guy because he associates, Commander Waterford with him. Nick tells her husband that she is now pregnant with child, and her husband loses it, but cooler heads prevail, and he says, hey, do you know about Hannah, my daughter? And he says, I don't. And he goes, look, tell her that I never stopped loving her and that Moira got out. And Nick says, actually, I have something for you. And he hands over the letters that all the handmaids had written to their loved ones. But while this is all going on, June is still trying to find a quote-unquote godmother for her child. And where else would you look, right? Aunt Lydia. And she asks Aunt Lydia, have you ever been a godmother for anybody? And Aunt Lydia, trying to be authoritative, says, look, I'll take a lot of stuff because you're a future expecting mother, but you can't talk like that. And Offred tells her, in my experience, if you're in a house where you have a guy who's going to beat a woman, that guy will also beat a child. And she needs to make sure that this child will be safe if she's not going to be in that house. And one of the people that can do that is Aunt Lydia. And Aunt Lydia assures her that I'll make sure that not only nobody harms this baby, but nobody harms any babies out there. And as Aunt Lydia's leaving, she reveals to Offred that she was, in fact, a godmother to a nephew. But we finally see a little bit of normalcy from Aunt Lydia, who's really been this Bible-thumping bitch up until this point. Back in Canada, though, armed with the letters, you've got Offred's husband, you've got Moira, you've got the chick that doesn't talk, and they're just sitting around the table reading these letters, absolutely horrified. And Moira says, I wish there was just like a bomb in here that could bring this whole thing down. And the girl that doesn't really talk says, I think this could be the bomb. I think all these letters could actually be the bomb. So they release the letters on the internet, and the next day, Commander Waterford and his wife come down for the itinerary, and they're met by the Canadian government, who says, you guys are no longer welcome here. They alert them to the letters being leaked. Commander Waterford says, how can you believe them? Yesterday you believed me. And they go, well, now we believe the girls. And the outrage for these letters is amazing. There's a ton of protesters that are following his cavalcade to the airport, and they all have signs that say, my name is so-and-so. And they're all former handmaids who have escaped, who were given new names, and they want to identify themselves. And as Commander Waterford is leaving, he shoots back at one of the diplomats that he's a coward. And as Mrs. Waterford is leaving, one of the women says, I can't believe what has happened to you. You used to be a well-respected woman. You used to be an author, and look what's become of you. And this does fluster Mrs. Waterford, and all she can do is kind of hold back and just say Bible scripture to her. With the Waterfords being forced to flee Canada, the refugees have a huge party, and at one point they just kind of stop and they start singing America the Beautiful, which is a pretty awesome scene. With the Waterfords back in Gilead, Mrs. Waterford starts unpacking, and she has a matchbook from a Hawaiian tiki bar, and she starts looking in her closet. She has all the same clothes, and she's starting to think to herself, this isn't really the life that I dreamed of. This isn't the life that I really want right now. Nick goes to June's room and tells her everything that happened. I met your husband, Moira got out, the letters got out, and it was a huge deal, and this gives June a little bit of hope that all of these good things happen. And she says to her baby, I used to think that you were never going to get out, but you know what? Fuck that. Episode 10 starts out with Emily, and she's going through the ceremony, which everybody kind of hates. And all of a sudden, the guy who's doing the ceremony to her has a heart attack, and the wife of the guy screams, get help, and Emily fires back, I think it's just best if I lay on my back. It works best that way. So the wife runs off to get help for her husband, who's dying, and Emily just starts railing on this guy, just starts kicking the shit out of him. And a bunch of rumors start spreading around of what exactly happened. Was the guy in her at the time? What did Emily do? But Emily is let go, and she's not arrested or anything. And she ends up seeing June in the market and talks to June about it. But while they're talking, June ends up going through some contractions, and they start the whole pregnancy ceremony that they do. So while this ceremony is going on, Mr. Waterford is handing out cigars, and Mrs. Waterford's wearing white, but it ends up being a false labor. And Mrs. Waterford walks into the room very perplexed, and you've got June sitting there with a shit-eating grin on her face and says, "I'm sorry, Mrs. Waterford," and then shoots back, "You know what? I really do think it's best that we never see each other again." And this bad blood dates back to the last episode, if you remember. And all this bad blood is going back to the fact that June does not want to leave this new child that she's going to have. So she goes to the commander and says, "Look, I need a favor. Your wife wants me to leave. I don't want to leave. So if you're going to transfer me, please transfer me to the district where my daughter is in." And Commander Waterford, usually pretty, nice to her, says, "I've been way too lenient on you." And they go back and forth for a little bit, and finally Commander Waterford just screams, "Get out." Obviously, this wasn't the reception that June was expecting, so as she's leaving, she gets a little bit of a pot shot in and says, "You never lost a child, so you don't understand. You never lost somebody of your own flesh and blood." And then looks at him and says, "Oh, and by the way, you never will." Obviously an indication that everybody knows the worst secret. This isn't his kid. So June, Offred, whatever you want to call her, drops the mic, walks off stage. This leads to an uncomfortable conversation between Mr. Waterford and Mrs. Waterford about June and Offred, saying, "I think she's forgotten her place." And Mrs. Waterford says, "Well, what can we really do? We just got to wait for this baby to arrive. And the doctor's not going to induce labor. But what I think's best is we just have it the natural way." And the natural way being the old wives' tale that if your wife or your girlfriend or whoever is pregnant, if you have sex with them really close to the due date, past the due date, on the due date, that will induce labor. Obviously, this would be rape in this situation. And that's pretty much exactly what happens. June is called into the bedroom where she has Mr. Waterford and Mrs. Waterford, and Mrs. Waterford says, "We really need this baby to come out now, and we're going to, do the natural thing." And they pin her down, and Mr. Waterford rapes her, and it's a really uncomfortable scene, and it's just, ugh. And even Mrs. Waterford, you can tell, doesn't really approve of what she just did. She kind of has a face that says, "What did I just do?" And they finish up, they leave, and June is just kind of left on the bed, lifeless. Right next door, you have Eden and Nick, the lovebirds, and as Eden is taking the trash out, she sees that douchebag soldier, and they make eye contact. And that soldier's been really nice to her, and you could clearly tell that this is a relationship that's going to bloom because Nick wants nothing to do with her. Because I'll remind everybody, she's 15. So all of a sudden, they start making out, they start fooling around, and out of nowhere, Eden sees that Nick is watching the whole time and not giving a fuck. And I think this is a good lesson for every guy out there, that if you don't pay attention to your 15-year-old wife, she is going to find another guy who will treat her right and take her to the soft hop. But enough with the PSA. She runs into the house and immediately starts asking Nick for his forgiveness. Nick's like, "Look, that's fine. Do what you want." And this has a huge blow-up of Eden finally yelling at him, "Why don't you care? Why don't you care that you just caught me cheating?" And then it dawns on her, and she says, "It's the handmaid, isn't it?" Nick tells her that I would never get involved with a handmaid. That would be suicide. And she starts hyperventilating, and you can just see Nick with that moment that pretty much every guy who's ever been in a relationship has of, "I can't believe I'm having to deal with this bullshit." The next day, June is still reeling from the fact that she was raped by not only really Mr. Waterford, but Mrs. Waterford. Commander Waterford comes in the room pretty sheepishly and says, "I've planned a surprise for you, and I think you'll like it." He puts her in the car with Nick and says, "Be back in 3 hours," and then hands him an address. He looks at Offred and says, "This is what you deserve," and kisses her on the forehead, and then tells Nick, "Don't let anyone see you." This is a golden opportunity for these two to literally just drive away together. But they don't. And on the ride up, Nick can tell that something's wrong, and he keeps asking her, "What did he do to you? What did he do?" But she is totally out of it. She keeps staring ahead. She's not really answering. Finally, though, they arrive at this house that kind of appears to be abandoned, but there's soldiers in it. And one of the soldiers says she has 10 minutes. And there is the surprise. It's her daughter. And the very thing she asked for. She just wanted to see her daughter. There she is. June starts obviously crying and goes to reach for Hannah, but Hannah doesn't really recognize her and kind of gets a little freaked out at first. Hannah goes and hides behind the Martha that she's with, and June keeps saying, Hannah, it's me, it's Hannah. And the Martha says, her name's Agnes now, which, I mean, come on, really? June asks if she remembers her, and Hannah gives a little bit of a nod because it's starting to kind of come back to her. Finally, Hannah just cuts to the chase and says, did you try to find me? And she says, I did. I tried so hard. Me and your daddy both tried. And she says, well, why didn't you try harder? Like, it's that simple. And Hannah says something that she's probably going to regret. It's okay. I've got new parents now. Hannah notices that June is pregnant and says, oh, you're pregnant, but you don't get to keep it. So Hannah has learned about this new world. And June says, well, no, I don't get to keep it, but you're always going to be my first baby. All of a sudden, the soldiers say, that's it. That's enough. We got to get her out of here. And they start shuffling her out. And June says, just give me one more second. Kneels down behind Hannah and says, I will always love you. Daddy will always love you. I will always be your mommy. And the last thing is just enjoy your life and love your parents. And they both start crying. June looks at the Martha and just says, please take care of my daughter. And with tears in her eyes, Hannah says, will we ever see each other again? And June says, we'll try, and they have to be ripped apart. It's a really emotional scene. Once Hannah leaves, June is uncontrollably sobbing because this is yet another time where her child has been ripped from her. All of a sudden, you start hearing tire screeching, and Nick says, that's it, we gotta go. We gotta get back in the house. Come on, June, because they're not supposed to be seen. Two men get out of the car, approach Nick, ask why he's there. Nick ends up giving a bad lie to him. And while June is hiding in the house, she sees that they end up shooting Nick, throwing him in the car, and taking off. So now you've got June, who's 9 months pregnant, stuck in the middle of nowhere in this house where God only knows who owns it, by herself. So where we end episode 10 is exactly where we pick up in episode 11, and June is now frantically searching this random house that she's in, looking for something to help her. And she ends up coming across a picture of Hannah, so she thinks that this might be a summer home, but clearly Hannah has been there before. And she sees a bunch of artwork that Hannah, we assume, has done. And all of a sudden, June gets a flashback of dropping Hannah off at school and Hannah not wanting to go to school and screaming for her mom to not leave her. Once she snaps out of this flashback of Hannah, she starts rummaging through some drawers and finds some keys. So she looks outside, makes sure the coast is clear, and ends up going to the garage that is adjacent to the house. And with June trying every key finally won't work, she opens up the garage, and there it is, an old-time car and her ticket out of here. She gets in the car, turns on the radio, and hears some news that England is going to lift their cap of refugees that they're accepting from Canada, and that India is helping Gilead, which, you know, we all know is formerly of Boston. So you're starting to see the allies form here. So she knows that she's close enough to the border because she's picking up the radio signal and gets out of the car and starts planning for a trip. She goes back in the house, puts together some perishables, some jugs of water, and grabs some blankets. And by the way, it should be known that the car that she found is not going to drive well in snow. The last thing she needs is a change of clothes because she does not want to flee wearing a handmaid's outfit. So she goes to the closet, but unfortunately all the clothes there are that ugly greenish outfit that the women wear. She does end up finding a pea coat, which will help her on the journey, but all of a sudden she starts hearing some screeching tires, and she ends up having to hide again. But it's not the people that took Nick, it's the Waterfords looking for their handmaid and, more importantly, the baby. They enter the house, they start screaming for Nick, they start screaming for Offred, they start screaming for the homeowners, and they find nobody, and it's pretty clear that these people are panicking. Mr. Waterford is trying to implore his wife to leave, go back to Gilead, and just make a plan because they're not supposed to be there. And Mrs. Waterford says, I'm not leaving without my baby. And they go in the kitchen and sees that drawers have been opened, so somebody has been there. While Mrs. Waterford starts looking through the house, she sees the red dress that Offred left when she took the coat, and she starts screaming for Fred, saying, you didn't think they were here, but they were. And then Commander Waterford says, this doesn't make any sense. Nick would never be this disloyal. The whole while, Offred is just hiding in the house, listening to this whole conversation. Commander Waterford and Mrs. Waterford end up having a big fight about who's to blame for this whole situation. And Commander Waterford says if you just showed her an ounce of respect, she never would seem to run away. And Mrs. Waterford says, yeah, well, you raped her yesterday. Maybe that's why she ran away. And Commander Waterford reminds her, oh, by the way, that was your idea. Mrs. Waterford ends up making a really good point that they can't even report her missing because you let her go missing once, that's bad enough, but twice, they'll put you on the wall for that. And while Commander Waterford and Mrs. Waterford are arguing, Offred finds a chest full of guns and finds a shotgun. She quietly starts loading that shotgun and points it down at the Waterfords. June can't bring herself to pull the trigger, which in all honesty is probably a good thing, because a shotgun 3 floors up, you're not really hitting much. You're not killing anybody. Eventually, the Waterfords ends up leaving, and June ends up going downstairs, but all of a sudden, she ends up having contractions. And these aren't fake contractions. These are real-deal contractions. But even with the contractions, June tries to get away. She goes to the car, but the garage door is locked. So she's going to have to bust through this thing, but it's not working. It's frozen shut, and because the car is in such a confined space, she can't get enough momentum to actually bust through the door. June ends up going back in the house, lighting a fire, and just getting ready for labor. And right before she does, though, she goes outside and starts firing off gunshots for people to come get her. But she starts pushing, gets through it, and there you have it, a baby. In episode 12, Offred has had a baby girl. She's healthy. Everything looks good. And she's also been picked up. The shotguns that she did before she gave birth have attracted some attention. And she gets brought back to kind of a detention center, one that she saw already, where her entire being is to pump milk. The problem is she's run dry because she's not actually feeding the baby. She's on just, the pump machines. And people are suggesting to Mrs. Waterford, hey, why don't you bring Offred in so she can actually nurse this child? And Mrs. Waterford can't stand that idea because she still views Offred as somebody who stole her child from her. But eventually Offred is brought to a separate room where Mr. Waterford is there and is going to allow Offred to feed this baby. But as soon as Offred starts feeding this baby and the milk starts coming, Commander Waterford rips the child away and says, all right, that worked. You basically turn the off switch on. And Aunt Lydia says, you can't keep doing this. You can't keep bringing the child to basically turn that switch on and then ripping the child away and pumping for milk. It's not going to work. You're going to have to actually let her nurse this child if you want it to survive. But Offred isn't the only person who's dealing with struggle right now, as Emily is putting together another household with another commander after her commander died in the previous episode. And this commander was one that got the economy really rolling in Gilead, but he seems like a super weird guy. Something is up with him. He's also going through handmaid after handmaid after handmaid. Something just seems off with this guy. The problem is Emily knows she needs to behave herself because she's probably on a last strike. At one point, the new commander catches Emily just reading a page, which is not allowed, and he says, do you know what the penalty for that is? She says, it's a finger. And he says, do you think that's fair? And she says, well, it's the law. And he replies with, well, it used to be a hand in the good old days. So that kind of tells you where this guy's mindset is. Eventually, though, June is let back into this house to feed this child. And this reunites June back with Nick, the father of her child, who coincidentally is looking for his wife who has run off. And Nick says to her, I wish we could be a family. I wish we could, see our baby. And they both agree that in ideal situations, he would run away together with the child, but they can't do that. But this is the first time where Nick actually acknowledges the fact that he is the father of this baby. Mrs. Waterford is having a really tough time with this child. Anytime the baby cries and the Martha comes in and asks, do you want me to take the baby? She gets really territorial, really bitchy, and snaps back no. And in a really pathetic scene, she actually tries to nurse the baby herself, which obviously is not going to work. But she's also having a tough time with this. Later that night, Commander Waterford comes down, and they're discussing Eden running away, and it's become apparent that she's run away with that soldier kid that she's kind of fallen for. And Commander Waterford says, I don't know why anyone would run away and risk everything to get away. And June smirks and says, yeah, neither do I. And Commander Waterford doesn't take kindly to this and says, well, where did you go when we came looking for you? And she admits, I was in the attic the whole time. And he goes, so you heard everything? She goes, yeah, I heard the whole thing, but I just said goodbye to my daughter, and I wanted to spend a little more time with my thoughts and with myself instead of coming home with you guys. And Commander Waterford asks, how was that meeting with your daughter? And she says, it was good. I was surprised to see her. And Fred Waterford replies with, good, I was happy I was able to do it for you. And June has to give him a very half-hearted thank you. But Commander Waterford's not really looking for a thank you like that. He says, is that the only thanks I get? And June says, we can play Scrabble sometime. And you could just tell that's not what Commander Waterford's really looking for in this situation. So he reluctantly walks out, unsatisfied, if you will. Over in Emily's new post, she finally meets the wife of this commander. And there's something also really off with the wife, who says, what's your name? And Emily replies with, of Joseph. And she says, no, your real name. And she says, Emily. And the wife confides in Emily that the commander is the one who created the colonies. And she says, I told him that those people digging the dirt, that's poison, and it was going to kill them. And then out of nowhere, the commander runs in, grabs her, and starts taking her away, with the wife screaming the whole time how much she hates him. So you're getting the impression that this guy is one of the worst people in Gilead. So now the commander has to have a conversation with Emily, so he brings her downstairs, pours a beer into 2 glasses, and says, hey, we value privacy in this house. And Emily asks if the wife is okay, and he says, well, life didn't exactly turn out the way she wanted. She was an art professor. They continue to go back and forth with some small talk, and Emily's giving him the lines that she's supposed to about God calling her, and he keeps calling her on the bullshit, saying, you don't believe that, you don't believe this. He starts bringing up her past transgressions and then asks about her wife and her child and says, you losing a child is tough. It's like losing a limb. But then again, you know all about that too, because obviously of what they took from her. The uncomfortable conversation seems to end with him saying, do you know if you've healed properly? It's a very tense scene. The next day, though, June is woken up by the Martha, who alerts her that Eden has been found along with the soldier kid, and they're bringing them back. And Eden actually has an opportunity to save her ass, but she won't, because this girl's so brainwashed that she will not lie. So they're sentenced to death because they won't lie. And look, Nick doesn't like the girl, but he doesn't want to see her die, too, and she's being ridiculously stupid with this whole situation. So she's brought to an indoor pool where they put ankle weights on her, and they ask her if she has one last thing to say, and she starts doing the whole Bible shit where June just rolls her eyes at the whole situation. Finally, they both just get thrown in the pool to die in front of the entire group. So the dust is starting to settle from Eden being executed. June finds her old Bible, and she's written a bunch of notes all over this thing, and she shows them to Mrs. Waterford, and Mrs. Waterford says, oh, well, I guess she had a multitude of sins that she was hiding. And June is very perplexed by this and says, what sins could she have been hiding? What sins would a 15-year-old girl be hiding? And finally, June gets to the whole issue at hand. How are you going to protect this child that I just had in this new world? And Mrs. Waterford says the child will grow up learning the Word of God. And June shoots back, how is she going to learn the Word of God? She can't even read the damn thing. And it's a great comeback. It's one that Mrs. Waterford doesn't want to hear, though. She tells her to get out. Eden's parents end up coming over to the Waterford household to apologize to not only Nick, but the Waterfords for what their daughter did, which, once again, was not a big deal. She ran off with a kid. She kissed him. But in their minds, she cheated on her husband. It's a sin that you end up getting killed for. And Commander Waterford's not exactly being very compassionate and says, yes, it was a grave sin that we allowed her to stay at our place. Eden's dad says that when Eden returned home, he immediately alerted the authorities. And June from the corner shoots back, you turned her in? While the commander thinks that this bodes well for the family, that he would follow the law that closely, conventional wisdom says, how do you turn in your daughter for that? As Commander Waterford's leaving, June asks, what are you to do when they come for your daughter? And the commander turns around and smacks her and says, watch your tongue. And kudos to June, who smacks him right back. He just starts reciting scripture in a very angry tone. I guess this is the way he diffuses situations. And eventually he leaves. He's not going to beat her anymore. Later that night, Nick goes to check on Offred, and while she goes to check on her, the Martha has their child, and they're finally able to all three of them be in the same room with this baby. And also, for the first time, Offred tells Nick that she loves him. So this is a nice little family moment. But what's messed up about this whole thing is she still knows her husband's alive in Canada. So stop cheating, girl. Over with Emily, though, she's going to have to go through the first ceremony with this new commander. And it's just not like your normal ceremony. Although, so far, nothing's been normal with this guy. He's playing music. He's lit a fire. Emily starts to kind of freak out a little bit, and she runs to the kitchen to grab a knife, and it looks like she's about to commit suicide. But right before she does it, the commander walks in and asks, do you know where the Martha is? And she says, no, I don't. And he sees that she's kneeling down, and he says, what are you doing? And she says, well, we have a ceremony tonight. He goes, I'm not doing that with you. Go back to your room. And while Emily's surprised, you don't have to tell her twice. She gets up and books it. Later that day, Mrs. Putnam and Mrs. Waterford are talking about their children and the future, and they decided they want to give both boys and girls the opportunity to actually have a voice in this society. And they're wondering if the women around the society feel the same way, and in fact, they all do. So this is really the first time that the women who sort of have a little bit of power are stepping up and wanting to have their voice heard. They approach the council with this, and Mrs. Waterford stands in front of them, and all the guys are kind of jabbing Mr. Waterford, did you forget your lunch today? And she stays very professional and thanks them for their time and thanks them for the ability to speak to them and says that people can bring amendments forward and we would like to do that. And Commander Waterford says, we, and the door opens and it's all of their wives. And the radical proposal that she brings these men is that women be allowed, wait for it, to read the Bible. I know, I'm going to give you time to digest this because it's horrifying news. Women reading the Bible. It's crazy. Mr. Waterford looks like he just wants to get this conversation over with and says, hey, We'll consider it seriously. Thank you for your time. But she's not done. Mrs. Waterford pulls out the Bible and starts reading it, a direct slap in the face to the administration. And while she's reading this, some of the wives are like, fuck this, I'm out, because, they don't want to lose their finger. But kudos to her, she just keeps reading on. All of the women are now waiting out in the hallway, and Commander Waterford comes out and says, thank you, you've given us a lot to consider. And Mrs. Waterford says, well, what did the others say? And it becomes pretty clear that Commander Waterford is pissed. Mrs. Waterford says, I did this for Nicole, which is what she's named the baby. So I did this for Nicole, I did this to set an example. And Commander Waterford says, so you have. And out of nowhere, 2 cops come to take her away. And Mrs. Waterford screams for them to stop and begging her husband to do something, but he doesn't do a damn thing. Over at Emily's new digs, though, things are going well, I guess. And Lydia stops by to see how the first ceremony went, and she alerts Emily that the new commander said that it went splendidly. Aunt Lydia makes kind of an offhanded comment, a little bit of a jab at her, and Emily just snaps. She grabs the knife and stabs Aunt Lydia right in the back. She goes as far as to throw her then down the steps. The Martha of the house shows up and is in shock. She yells for the commander and then looks at Emily and says, my God, what have you done? She then grabs her, throws her in a room, and just yells, stay there. While Emily is sitting in this room, the reality of what she has done has set in. She really doesn't know this commander. She's just murdered somebody. If they're willing to cut off a finger for just reading a book, what are they going to do for murder? Emily's commander walks into the room and just looks and says, well, what are we going to do with you? He takes her downstairs and his wife comes out of the room and says, wait, but he shuffles her along and says, go back in the room. You don't need to be here for this. The wife yells that she's never got to say goodbye to Emily and yells, it was nice knowing you. The whole while, Emily has no idea what's going on, but she's forced to get in the commander's car and go off with him. With Emily in the back seat, the commander says, you must be so proud of yourself. But he doesn't really seem mad, and even puts on music and starts dancing. I'm telling you, this guy is a really weird fella. The Waterfords arrive home, and actually Mrs. Waterford is the first one to walk in, but something is definitely up, and June senses it. They walk up to the bedroom, and June kind of follows suit to see what's up. Mr. Waterford's taking off her jacket and says, we've had a long day. He then says, I'm going to go make you some tea. And at this point, it's just June and Mrs. Waterford in the room together, where June asks, what happened? Mrs. Waterford starts unraveling a bandage on her hand to reveal that she indeed did have a finger cut off for reading the Bible. A beaten woman, she just looks up at June and says, I tried. June marches downstairs where the commander is still on edge and confronts him and says, I can't believe you let them do that to her. His only response is to say, we all have a role to play, and let that be a reminder to her. He adds that an obedient handmaid might be able to stay in this house and asks her how that sounds. June reminds the commander that this isn't possible, and the commander says, well, exceptions can be made for high-ranking officials, and you could even stay here with your baby. And hey, we can even try for another one, this time a boy. June has the most disgusted look on her face, and finally she says, go fuck yourself, Fred. But that doesn't deter Fred, who says, I might be able to arrange more meetings with Hannah, but June just shakes her head. Right before leaving the room, Fred says, hey, you just think about it. But she seems like she's made up her mind. While June is nursing her baby, she looks outside and sees that the adjacent house is on fire, and the Martha of the house runs in and says, we got to get you and your baby out of here. Look, we can get you out of here right now, but you got to go right now. And June's a little perplexed and says, who's we? And she says, the Marthas, but you got to go right this second. Nick's outside directing traffic from the fire, and as June is getting information from the Martha on where to go, she makes eye contact with him, and he just kind of gives her a nod. So he knows what's going on. While all this is going on, Commander Waterford is in his office, but he sees that there's a commotion outside, and he goes downstairs and to see what's up. He starts screaming for Nick, and then he starts screaming for the Martha and asks her if she knows what's going on, but she simply pleads ignorance. He can tell that something is going on, something's up, so he frantically starts searching through the house. He notices that the baby's gone, and then he starts screaming for Offred, but she's clearly gone too. He walks into the room where she was staying, and she's carved something into the wall. I'm pretty sure that it's the same thing she carved in the first season. It's Latin. I'm sorry, folks. I don't speak Latin. It was an elective in high school. I chose Spanish. My bad. At this point, Nick has made his way upstairs, and the commander starts screaming at him to get a team together because somebody's taken his baby. But Nick actually gets in his way and puts his hand on him and says, it's really dangerous out there, sir. I think we're going to stay here. June is weaving through back alleys and backyards with the help of the Marthas, but she's seen by Mrs. Waterford, who asks, what the hell are you doing? While Mrs. Waterford wants the child back, June is pleading with her, saying, this child cannot grow up here. You know that, and I know that, and I can get her out of here, so just let me go. And unfortunately for Mrs. Waterford, she knows that June's right. If you're a girl growing up in this world, it's impossible. You're in a no-win situation. So with tears in her eyes, she asks June if she can just say goodbye to the baby. So Mrs. Waterford has a teary goodbye for Nicole, the daughter that she actually didn't birth. Her and Offred have a civil goodbye, and while the fire blazes in the background, June tries to escape. With the help of every single Martha, June is now with the baby hiding in the weeds near a bridge, like an underpass, and a car shows up and just stops and starts flashing his high beams. June ends up coming out having no idea who the hell this person is. And it's actually Emily's commander's car, and Emily's in the back. He lets her out of the back and just says, Godspeed. So clearly this commander that we all thought was like the most evil guy in the world is trying to do a little bit of good in this world. Another car shows up. The commander yells, have a nice life, and Emily gets in the car. June is now standing in the street holding the baby, and Emily is begging her to hurry the hell up. June slowly walks to the car, hands her the baby, says, call the baby Nicole, tell the baby I love her, close the door, and stays. The car goes off, and she's still in Gilead, in one of the most frustrating season finales I've ever watched. And that is the end of Season 2 of The Handmaid's Tale. Make sure to like and subscribe. I'll try to get recaps up pretty regularly. They're kind of lengthy to do. But if there is a show that you guys want me to recap, just make sure to comment in the comments section, and I will try to get to it.